Hello, everybody. I'm Mark Levine, City Council member from the 7th District in Northern Manhattan. Welcome to another edition of Represent NYC. Today we'll be looking at one of the most game-changing new developments for tenants in New York City, the rollout of the right to counsel for all tenants facing eviction in New York City Housing Court. New York City is the first place in America to launch this new right, and it's going to change everything about housing court for tenants. We're going to look today at the decades of inequality for tenants in housing court that led for the need for this law, the process of how this historic legislation was passed, and most importantly, what it means for you and tenants around the 5 boroughs. I am thrilled that to discuss this topic today, we are joined by my colleague in the City Council, Vanessa Gibson, council member from the Bronx and lead co-sponsor of this legislation. We're also joined by Judith Goldiner, from one of the leading voices for legal aid for tenants in the city. Later in the program, we're going to be joined by tenant activist Estefania Trujillo. Vanessa, tell us, why was this historic legislation necessary for tenants in your district and in housing courts around the 5 boroughs?
It was necessary because tenants were going to housing court without legal representation. 99% of tenants had no representation and 1% did. And majority of the landlords all had lawyers going to court. And the reality is we wanted to balance the scales of justice. We wanted to provide equity in all housing courts across the 5 boroughs to let tenants know that we support them, we're with them, and we want to give them the fundamental right to have access to counsel. And we truly believe it's a fundamental right, just like we believe that access to affordable and quality housing is a fundamental right. It's not a luxury, but it's a necessity. And average in the Bronx, my county, there were 11,000 evictions every year. That affects families, immigrants, seniors, children, many families on a fixed income and a low income living below the federal poverty level. So for me, this was about providing equity, providing fairness, and the bottom line, saving families, keeping them in their homes, reducing the shelter burden, reducing homelessness, because we have seen the crisis across the city, and really making sure that residents went to court equipped with a lawyer.
Yes. As you mentioned, the city is in the midst of an eviction crisis. Tens of thousands of New Yorkers have been losing their homes every year because of eviction. Many thousands more are simply walking away from their homes during eviction proceedings because of the intimidation of that process, and it is feeding our homeless crisis. The #1 cause of family homelessness in New York City is not addiction or mental health issues. It is the loss of a home through an eviction. Tell us, Judith, why are lawyers so critical to giving tenants a fair shot in housing court and to preventing the epidemic of eviction?
Well, because many tenants don't know what their rights are. So many lawyers would tell you that New York State's housing laws are very, very complicated. It's much more complicated if you're not represented by counsel. What we find is when we get involved, people have defenses. A lot of times tenants live in rent-regulated housing and are being overcharged. They might not know they were rent-regulated. Often when they have a lawyer, we can get their rent reduced. We can make sure that they can pay their rent moving forward. We can resolve the case in a way that prevents that eviction.
Is it fair to say that in almost every case, if the tenant has an attorney, they have a better chance of staying in their home or negotiating more favorable terms?
Absolutely. We're not able to save everyone's home. I mean, sometimes we can't, although, we have almost a 90% success rate. But when we can't save someone's...
That's incredible. So you have a 90% success rate of helping a tenant remain in their home if you have an attorney on the case?
Absolutely. But even for the 10% who we can't save their home, sometimes people just are living in a home that they, there's a percentage of people who live in homes that are not regulated, so you don't have a right to a renewal lease. There are some people who are just living in an apartment that they can't afford anymore. Even for those clients, we're able to almost always negotiate a resolution that's more favorable to the tenant. Maybe it's a move out that makes sense for them and their family. We help them figure out what their other options are. Sometimes we're able to help people think about bringing in a roommate or taking other steps so that they can afford the rent going forward. In any ways, we are able to problem solve, and I think that what is sometimes missed in the whole thing is that often it's better for both the landlord and the tenant for us to be involved because we are able to resolve the case in a way that's mutually beneficial for everyone.
That's right. Look, we've had a right to counsel in criminal cases since the 60s. I believe, and I know you share this view, that anyone facing a life-altering judgment, whether it's incarceration, loss of your home, deportation, loss of custody of your kids, needs to have representation. And these are civil proceedings, they're not criminal, but the implications are life-changing. And so we've made this case for civil justice in an arena that has suffered from unequal playing fields for far too long. Of course, the landlord lobby was not happy with this effort, and we won. We won this one against big odds and big forces. Vanessa, you were there with me in the trenches. How did we win this one? What was the secret to our success?
I've been asked that question a lot, and I think it started in 2014 when we first introduced Intro to 14, the right to counsel legislation. But it really started with a fundamental belief that this was just the right thing to do. It was reasonable, it was practical, and when you looked at the number of evictions, you looked at the high concentration in communities of color, northern Manhattan, central Brooklyn, South Bronx, we knew it was the right thing to do. And getting together elected officials, our colleagues in the city council, tenant advocates, civil legal service providers, coming together with the right mindset, with the right priority and the right mission, it wasn't easy. We had to convince a lot of people that it was the right thing to do. But we truly believed that it was going to make an impact, make a difference, save lives. There are so many unintended consequences when you lose your home to an eviction. You can lose your job, you lose stability, and we wanted to do, what was right by tenants. There are more tenants in this city than there are landlords. And for me and you both representing high concentrations of multifamily dwellings, of high density in a lot of buildings, we knew it was the right thing to do. So I am grateful. This has been like life-changing. This has been groundbreaking. And now we're seeing other municipalities across this nation that are looking at some form of universal right to counsel. DC, Cleveland, Newark, New Jersey, Los Angeles, San Francisco, all of these municipalities that are saying, look at what they did in New York City. What's the secret? But in addition, while I believe that the concept and the mindset was a really important part of it, we also needed the money behind it. We needed the administration to realize that this investment of money was going to save families, prevent evictions, prevent homelessness, and keep families in their homes. As we build out more affordable housing, as we draw down on the numbers in homeless shelters, we also have to recognize preservation is a huge part of that conversation. And I look at right to counsel and keeping families in their home as a part of housing preservation.
That's right. And look, you point out the financial angle. This initiative will save the city money. We spend on average $40,000 per year to house a family in our shelter system. And the average stay is more than a year now. We can spend a couple $1,000s up front for an attorney in housing court and keep that family in the home. So there's a huge human benefit for that family, but the city's also going to save some money. A big part of the case that we went out and made, and we had an incredible coalition of not just tenant activists and legal service providers, but faith leaders, union leaders, academics, the mainstream legal community, the mainstream bars, and just some of the most incredible activists that I've ever had the honor to work with, including our allies at CASA, that were just fierce and effective and strategic in this fight. And in the end, we did win historic victory.
Absolutely.
And we're now marking a one-year anniversary. We passed this bill last August in 2017, or the bill was signed in August of 2017. We're coming up on the one-year mark. This is such a big program that the rollout itself is a 5-year process. We traditionally had over 200,000 eviction proceedings a year, and to ramp up to full service is going to take a while. But we've got year one underway, and it's already had a huge impact. Tell us, Judith, what's changed now in housing court for tenants 1 year into this implementation?
Well, I think there's a lot of ways it's changed. I mean, you touched on the fact that evictions are dramatically down. 20%. I mean, that's huge when you think about that.
That's incredible. So thousands of families
Right. So
are in their homes tonight who
Because-
might have been evicted for lack of an attorney.
Exactly. So that's huge to watch the eviction numbers, even in this crazy expensive city, go down. That's huge. What we really see also in housing court is the increase in attorneys for tenants is making a difference in the culture of the court. So we have so many more lawyers there representing tenants that even for the tenants who are not represented, we see a change in the way the court treats tenants. And we see a change in how the court is reacting, how much more decisions are being written, how much more seriously the court is taking things. And also, we also see a drop in the number of orders to show cause. Now, this may not be,
Explain
this may
the
be a
jargon
little,
there.
this may be a little technical, but it used to be that tenants had to go back over and over and over to get more time so that they could pay. When you have a lawyer, you take that motion out because lawyers are able to resolve these things without having to keep on going back to court. We take those things out of the court, and that's better for the tenants because they don't have to show up. Every time a tenant has to show up in court, they're going to lose a day of wages. It's going to make it harder for them to pay the rent. We take all that out. Now, there's certainly been pushback. I'm not going to tell you there hasn't. The landlord lawyers are very unhappy about what's happened, and they're definitely trying to push back on our lawyers and on the tenants that don't have lawyers.
Right.
But I feel like we've been very effective at trying to counter that, at pushing back on what they're doing and on making it a fairer, much fairer playing field for tenants.
We know that for years, really decades, landlords could count on the fact that when they took a tenant to court, the tenant was probably not going to have an attorney. And so they were often hauling tenants into court on very flimsy grounds, knowing that, well, the tenant will be intimidated, maybe they'll take a buyout, maybe they'll
Maybe
even
won't
just
show up.
or maybe not show up or just walk away. Perhaps the tenant would be undocumented and would mistakenly believe that that in some way diminished their rights as tenants. Of course, the truth is everyone has the same rights as a tenant. It's not dependent on your citizenship status. But without an attorney, the tenant might not know that. And landlords were banking on that and really developed a business model. So we have certainly heard anecdotally that there are some landlords that are thinking twice before hauling a tenant into court because now they're much more likely to face an attorney on the other side. Do we have numbers yet? Is that the number of cases is dropping?
We do. It's not as dramatic as the number of as the evictions going down, but we are starting to see less cases brought to court. Now, we hope that's because they don't want to face a lawyer. I worry a little that they're doing more intimidation up front, but that's why it's so important that we have, organizers in the field letting people know you have rights, don't just move out. I mean, I spend so much time, and I know they spend more time on the phone with people saying, this notice doesn't mean you have to leave. And I think that's so important that people need to know that you have to go to court, you have to fight back, that don't just move out when you get a notice from the landlord that says you have to leave. And people, I think, often don't understand what their rights are. And if they don't come to court, we're not in a position to kind of let them know what they are.
In addition, I would also add that it's really incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we get the message out about right to counsel, about the eligibility, making sure that when you call 311, you're referred to an attorney, using public service announcements and making sure that we meet tenants as best as we can where they are so they understand what's available. And also language access for our communities is very important. It's really confusing when you go into housing court if English is not your primary language to understand what's going on. So we're trying to be very creative and innovative in our approach to promote right to counsel to ensure that residents are taking advantage of it.
That's right. So we're going to pause now. I want to thank you, Judith, for everything you've done to help lead this fight and what you're doing for tenants day in and day out. We appreciate your voice in this conversation. Vanessa and I will be back in a moment to continue our discussion of this critical topic. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Mark Levine, City Council member from Northern Manhattan. We're continuing our discussion on the landmark legislation that gives every tenant in New York City facing an eviction the right to an attorney in housing court. And I am thrilled that we're joined now by tenant organizer Estefania Trujillo, who's come in from Flatbush, Brooklyn, where she's an organizer with the Flatbush Tenant Union, to give us her perspective on this important legislation. Start us off, Estefania, with telling us about why your constituents the residents of your community needed the strength of this legislation behind them?
Yeah, definitely. So at Flatbush Tenant Coalition, we also had a similar reform housing court like CASA did. And it was a little bit different, but a lot of their concerns was also, the environment that, the hostility that was happening in housing court, specifically because tenants were scared to go to court because they didn't have legal representation. And so having, this right to counsel that was, tenant-led, result into the passing of this new legislation, this new right, we're starting to change the dynamics of housing court, but also building power within our tenant associations.
Tell us how the passage of this law has changed your work as an organizer.
Yeah, so when we do a lot of tenant association work, even when we start, a lot of tenants are scared to just even call 311 to report lack of repairs. And one of the first things we do when we start a tenant association is we mention right to counsel, and we use it as a way to get rid of that fear, right? Because right now you have this new right, and you can use it to fight against the lack of repairs because you're getting rid of that fear, because you have lawyers right behind you, an ally, if they ever do send you to housing court.
It's such a critical point. Tenants often live in fear because they feel like they're going to be overpowered in court by a landlord with limitless resources. And sometimes, instead of fighting, they just suffer in silence
or leave.
Or even walk away from their apartment, which is heartbreaking. Or maybe they'll take a paltry buyout. They'll take a $5,000 or $10,000 buyout to leave their apartment. Now, you can't replace housing in New York City for $5,000 or $10,000. You're going to be homeless after you burn through that in 6 months. What advice do you have, Vanessa, to a tenant who's facing an unjust eviction proceeding or harassment from their landlord?
I would say to any tenant, number one, you are not alone. Please do not suffer in the shadows of darkness. There is so much help out there. We are imploring you to please come forward. Your status does not matter, your zip code, your ethnicity, the neighborhood you live in, none of that matters. But please know that there is help out there. And through Right to Counsel, you have a fundamental right to an attorney if you're facing eviction proceedings in housing court. So number one, we want you to call 311.
Yes.
We want you to seek help. We want you to talk to someone. Call your local elected official.
Right.
Call your borough president. Call your local community board. There are so many outlets out there. We want you to know that you're not alone. It is heartbreaking for any resident in this city to feel the burden of an unscrupulous landlord.
Yeah.
I will tell a tenant there are power in numbers. There are more of us than there are of them. And I say us because I'm a tenant too. And I live in a rent-regulated apartment building, and I see what my tenants go through. And there is power in organizing, because a lot of this work is really a part of a movement. And in order for this Right to Counsel to have even been successful, tenants who were facing eviction had to come forward and tell their story. They turned their pain into a plan with a purpose, and they realized, I am not alone. I won my case, and so can you.
That's
so
right.
To any tenant out there that feels that they may be facing an eviction, it may be illegal, regardless if you are behind in your rent, there is help out there. And please seek us, please reach out to us, call 311 so that we can give you the help you need.
And we do have a lot of work to do to get the word out about this new right. I mean, the right to counsel in criminal court, because it's been in place nationwide for 50 years and been the subject of umpteen Law and Order episodes, everyone knows about it. But I have to say, most tenants that I encounter, unless they're very plugged in and politically active, don't yet know about this right. So, Estefania, what are you doing on the ground to spread the word so tenants understand about this brand new power that they have?
Yeah, definitely. So in Flatbush, most of the, well, pretty much everyone in the community there is Caribbean, immigrant, working families, seniors, people of color who are being targeted, by landlords so that they can, take these apartments back for profit. And one of the things that we're doing is, because of Right to Counsel, is we're focusing on landlord cohorts. So we're identifying target landlords, who are using housing court as an eviction mill. And we're basically working with different buildings, with tenant leaders in all of those buildings to kind of find the patterns that landlords are doing, like the patterns of harassment that they're using against tenants, and then kind of building that power that you mentioned, building tenant power to fight against, harassment through construction, through, housing court, lack of repairs and things like that. Yeah.
That proactive work is so important. If we don't connect a tenant to an attorney until the day they walk into court, they're at a disadvantage. You want the attorney involved as soon as possible, preferably before there's even an eviction proceeding in cases where the landlord is depriving the building of essential services, engaging in harassment, raising the rent beyond the legal maximum, all the kinds of conditions that you described. Using construction as a weapon is a shockingly common tactic by the most abusive landlords. One that we've learned in recent days has been used by the Kushner family and Michael Cohen. These are two Trump inner circle people. People outside of New York City might think this is an obscure thing, but it's right out of the playbook of the worst landlords in New York City. We are seeing attorneys for landlords try and circumvent this new right to counsel, which comes into play when tenants walk into a court, by trying to connect the tenants before they show up to court, by even going to them when they're in line in the morning and saying, I have a great deal for you. And I can't guarantee it's going to be on the table once you walk in and start to your attorney. How can we get to tenants before they're in the midst of a high-pressure coercion campaign by the landlord representatives?
Yeah, definitely. So like in CASA, Northwest Bronx, Flatbush Tenant Coalition, we started focusing on the first 3 subcodes per each borough. And so what we've been doing is just cold outreach. What that means is just knocking on doors of buildings that maybe we haven't worked with before, but kind of letting them know what their rights are, asking them, would you want to start a tenant association? And we really say that it's very important. There's some buildings that maybe the landlord just purchased and he hasn't started to kick everyone out yet, but we mentioned, listen, you need to start organizing. These are the patterns that we're identifying in other buildings. It's really important for you to organize. And we really try to identify tenant leaders in all of the buildings to really get them to take part. And also, you can identify them as well through the 311 calls. And they're really a key component in helping us, spread the word throughout all of the zip codes and even beyond that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Vanessa, we have talked about taking this historic legislation and making it even more comprehensive and making it even stronger. We call it Right to Counsel 2.0. Tell us about where you think the future of Right to Counsel needs to go in New York City.
So I think we recognize that with Intro 214, Universal Right to Counsel, we had to start somewhere, and there had to be an income threshold. And we used the federal poverty levels and 200% of the federal poverty line as our maximum where tenants would be eligible. But we realized that that wouldn't capture everyone. So we realized that as we continue to expand from year 1 to year 2, as we expand in the various zip codes throughout the 5 boroughs, we needed to make sure we captured the households that were above 200%. And many of these families are working class New Yorkers. They are still income based. They're still on fixed incomes, same populations, people of color, seniors, etc. So we realized that we had to capture them in some way, because right now under the current law, they are eligible for some level of a consultation, but not a full-fledged service from beginning to end. And that's not enough. So 2.0 is going to be new legislation introduced in the City Council by both us, and it's going to look at raising that threshold to 400% of the federal poverty level, because we want to recognize many of the families that fall right in the middle of that income bracket, and we want to say to them that they are just as important as everyone else. We did have to start somewhere, so I want to recognize that we couldn't start and serve everyone, but we did want to say do this in stages. So I believe that this is the right approach, and when we continue conversations with the Right to Counsel Coalition on 2.0, we want to make sure that we capture the remaining New Yorkers that are still facing rent burden, that are still facing harassment by landlords, and all the other challenges that many New Yorkers are facing today.
That is absolutely right. We're going to keep fighting to expand this right. We want to emphasize to viewers that don't sit with the calculator and try and figure out whether your family's gross income is above or below the threshold.
Just call.
If you are facing an eviction, if you're facing landlord harassment, don't wait. Reach out for help. You can go to your local council member or elected official, a local tenant advocates group, legal aid provider, or you can call 311. We are also in the 2.0 version of our legislation. We're making sure that residents of public housing are covered, all residents, not just when they appear in housing court, but there's a first step for NYCHA residents in administrative hearings. And we want to make sure that all NYCHA residents have an attorney in administrative hearings, and we also want to make sure that residents in other government housing, whether it's HUD housing, DHCR housing, Mitchell-Lama housing is covered, and we want to cover tenants on appeal. Because sometimes there can be a second round of legal battle. And we're also pushing to make sure that the Office of Court Administration, which runs the courts, implements this in a way that gives access to everybody, that has great translation services, that has good signage, that gives a private space for the tenant to consult with their attorney so they're not exposed to being overheard by potentially the landlord for the landlord's attorney or anyone else. We have a lot of work to do to make sure this is implemented in an efficient way that is accessible to everybody, whatever language they speak, whatever their background. We have made huge progress, but we're going to continue to fight. Estefania, what is your message to tenants today about how to fight when they're confronted with this kind of abuse?
Definitely, and what I would say to them is, don't give up. You know, as a daughter of immigrants, like I'm an immigrant myself, we came to this country. You know, we provided such a benefit to the communities that we're from, and that we should just fight. You know, so hard to stay in our homes. We shouldn't give up. We shouldn't allow landlords, you know, who have all this power to bring us down, right? And we have rights, and even before right to counsel, we did have rights, but we didn't know about them. But the best thing is that now we have another tool. We have this other right that we can use alongside, you know, our tenant association, our communities, to fight against that. We deserve to stay in our homes. Housing is a human right, and if landlords don't believe it, then we're going to show them, because we have more tenants than we have landlords, and we just need to fight back.
What an eloquent and powerful message to close on. We are out of time. This is such a big topic. We could continue. I want to thank you, Estefania, for not just being here, but the work you're doing for tenants day in and day out. And of course, to my partner in this effort, the incredible Vanessa Gibson, council member from the Bronx. Thank you for everything you've done, for being the best partner that I could have asked. We're only beginning to accomplish things for tenants. I look forward to continuing to work with you and our colleagues. And I want to thank our viewers for joining us on another edition of Represent NYC. Thank you so much.